Welcome to this journey through one of the most disturbing stories that the enclosed valleys of Tennessee have ever kept silent. There is a kind of place in the world that seems to have been forgotten by time, not because time passed too quickly, but because something within that place made sure that no one stayed around to tell what had happened. Red Hollow was like that, a fold in the earth, more than a village, a place where the mountains curved back on themselves, as if trying to hide what grew below. Before we begin, if you enjoy this type of content and want to support the channel, the link to my ebook is in the description and in the pinned comment. Your support is what keeps this kind of content alive here. The year was 1899. Tennessee was experiencing that strange moment that happens every time a century is about to turn, a mixture of hope with the feeling that something will be left behind. In larger cities like Nashville and Knoxville, people talked about progress, about train tracks that would soon reach deeper into the mountains, about electric light that would one day illuminate even the most remote valleys. But in the Appalachian Mountains, especially in that rugged and vertical stretch of eastern Tennessee, progress seemed like a conversation belonging to another people. There, the seasons reigned supreme. Winter closed the passes with snow and mud. Summer transformed the vegetation into living walls of dark green that made it impossible to see more than a few meters ahead. And autumn. Autumn was the only time when the mountains revealed their true structure, when the leaves fell and the bones of the earth were exposed. Red Hollow was nestled between two parallel ridges, separated by a valley so narrow that sunlight reached the bottom for only a few hours a day. The rest of the time, the shadow of the mountains covered everything with that damp twilight that makes wood rot faster, that makes moss grow on the rocks with an almost aggressive intensity. Those who came from outside, and few did, described the place as a natural corridor, as if the earth had been folded in half on purpose, creating a hideaway that nature itself had built without anyone asking. In that valley, there were few families. Mostly farmers. They cultivated what the steep soil allowed. Corn, beans, some root vegetables. They raised pigs. They hunted what came down from the slopes. They lived in an isolation that for them was not loneliness, but simply the world as it should be. Their distrust of strangers was not hostility. It was pragmatism. Each person who arrived from outside brought with them news that was not always welcome. New diseases, new laws, new questions. And then there were the Callaways. If Red Hollow was already a place separate from the rest of Tennessee, the Callaways were separate from Red Hollow itself. The family occupied the highest lands in the valley, not the most fertile but the most strategic. From up there they could see who entered and who left through the only path that cut across the bottom of the valley. They could observe without being observed. The Callaway property began where the main trail made a sharp left turn, and from there, anyone trying to continue uphill had to necessarily pass through their land. There was no way around it. The slopes on both sides were too steep. Elias Callaway was the patriarch, a man who was already past 60 when this story begins, but who carried the body with the rigidity of someone who never allowed age to bend his posture. Tall, broad-shouldered, with those hands that the people of the valley described as hands that had built things, but also as hands that had destroyed. He spoke little. When he did speak, people listened, not necessarily out of admiration, but because of that hard-to-name feeling that certain men evoke, the feeling that crossing their will has a cost you might not be willing to pay. The family was large. Elias had 4 grown sons, all living on the same property or on adjacent plots that their father had divided over the years. There were also the dependents, workers who lived on the edges of the Callaway land in exchange for work and protection. And there was Marvella, Elias's wife, about whom almost no one spoke directly. The women of the valley described her carefully, using vague words. They said she knew the plants of the mountains better than anyone alive. They said she never descended to the bottom of the valley. They said her eyes were too clear for a woman who had lived so long. What the Callaways possessed, besides the land, was something more difficult to map. They possessed the narrative of the place. They were the ones who mediated when disputes arose between neighbors. They were the ones who decided, unofficially but absolutely real, who could build where, who could use which stretch of the creek, who could hunt on which slope. There was no written law granting them this power, but in Red Hollow written law was a distant abstraction. What mattered was what actually existed, and what actually existed was what the Callaways commanded. That in itself wouldn't be extraordinary. In the isolated valleys of Appalachia, families like that existed in dozens of places. Concentrated power, defended territory, unwritten hierarchy. It was the norm. What made the Callaways different? What made the older residents of Red Hollow lower their voices when mentioning the family name was something that couldn't be easily explained with concrete facts. It was more of an accumulation of small things, of absences, of moments when someone had asked the wrong question and then vanished from the conversation, from daily life, from the entire valley. No one had disappeared spectacularly. There wasn't a single stormy night when someone screamed and then fell silent. It was more subtle than that. It was the drover who had stopped at the Callaway property to spend the night on his way to the neighboring county, and who weeks later, when someone remembered to ask about him in another village, had arrived nowhere. It was the man who had tried to buy a piece of land on the property's border, and who, after 3 visits to the Callaways, had simply stopped showing up. His family in some distant county had received a letter in his handwriting, they said, informing them that he had decided to go west, but those who knew him well said he had never spoken of going anywhere. They were loose threads, untied ends. And in 1899, when the snow began to melt on the highest ridges of the Appalachian Mountains and the Red Hollow Valley began to open up to another spring cycle, a new thread began to unravel. This time, in a way that would be harder to ignore. A woman had arrived in the valley, alone with suitcases far too heavy for someone claiming to be just passing through, and she had asked on the first night about the Callaways, with a familiarity no one expected from a stranger, and that's when the valley began to realize that something was about to change. The woman who arrived in Red Hollow at the beginning of that spring of 1899 was not the type of person the valley's inhabitants were accustomed to seeing around. He wasn't a drover. He wasn't an itinerant preacher. He wasn't a businessman trying to buy cheap land on behalf of some Eastern company. He was a woman of perhaps 40, named Dessa Wren, with dark hair carelessly tied back, and a look that the people of the valley described in slightly different ways, but which converged on the same feeling, that of someone who had seen things she could no longer unsee. Dessa had arrived on foot via the southern route, the only access to the valley that didn't require crossing Callaway lands. It was a long and difficult path, full of roots and loose stones, climbing and descending 2 ridges before finally plunging into the narrow depths of Red Hollow. Those who made this journey usually did so on horseback, or at least with an animal to carry the weight. Dessa had made it on foot, with 2 bags tied to a wooden frame that she carried on her back as if it were part of her body, something that had become an extension of herself over a long period of walking. She sought shelter at the first house she found, a small property belonging to a widower named Harmon Giles, who grew corn on the narrow, flat strip bordering the valley's main creek. Harmon was known for his hospitality, not exactly out of generosity, but out of that practical solidarity of isolated valleys, where today you shelter a stranger because tomorrow you might be the stranger in need. She stayed 3 nights at Harmon's house, sleeping in the barn, paying with coins that Harmon later described as more than necessary, which in itself had caught her attention. On the second night, while they were having tea by the wood-burning stove, Dessa had asked the question, not hesitantly, not with the caution of someone testing the waters. She had asked directly, what did the people of Red Hollow know about the Callaways? Harmon later described how the question had paralyzed him for a moment, not by the question itself, but by the way it had been phrased, as if Dessa already knew part of the answer and was only looking for the missing piece. Harmon had given the answer any sensible person would give under those circumstances. He had said that the Callaways were a good, hard-working family who had built a lot in that valley. He had said this looking at the flame of the stove, without looking at Dessa, and she had let the silence settle for a long moment before saying, with a tranquility that Harmon could never forget, that she had come to Red Hollow because of a man. A man who had disappeared after crossing the valley 3 years before, and who had last been seen according to the only people who still remembered, near the Calloway property. Harmon hadn't slept well that night. The man Dessa was looking for was named Virgil Wren, her husband. She didn't use that word often. She said, "The man I'm looking for," more than "my husband," as if the 3 years of searching had created a fog over the exact nature of what lay between them. Virgil was a drover. He traveled routes between the counties of eastern Tennessee, buying and selling various goods, tools, fabrics, spices, sometimes animals. He was a man of the roads, accustomed to long absences. So, when he hadn't returned on the expected date, Dessa had waited another week, then another, then a whole month. Then he started asking questions. Asking about someone who had disappeared on rural Tennessee roads in the late 19th century was an exercise in patience and frustration. There was no organized system for it. There was no central place where absences were recorded. Each county functioned independently. The roads were the responsibility of no one and everyone at the same time. And the men who traveled alone on these roads disappeared with a regularity that no one considered abnormal. Accidents, illnesses, blows from strangers, sudden decisions to start a new life elsewhere. The line between the man who had died in a ditch and the man who had simply left was often impossible to identify. Dessa had spent 2 years tracing the path Virgil had taken on that last journey. She had spoken to shopkeepers, blacksmiths, and stable owners in the counties he had passed through. She had pieced together, piece by piece, a map of her husband's route, right up to the point where the route simply stopped. There was no sign of an accident. There was no record of illness. There was no one who had seen Virgil leave one point and never reach the next. The trail had dissolved, like mist over the creek at dawn, near Red Hollow. 2 people had mentioned the name Calloway in connection with Virgil. One had said that he had seen a drover matching Virgil's description stop at the Calloway property to spend the night. The other had said that he had heard, from someone who had heard from someone else, that the drover had left the property the following morning and headed north. But no one had actually seen it. It was the weakest possible chain of testimony, and at the same time it was the only thread Dessa had, so she had come. What the residents of Red Hollow didn't know, something that would only become clear much later, was that Dessa Wren hadn't come just to search. She had come with a determination that went beyond the search itself. She had spent 3 years thinking about it. She had traced possibilities in her head during sleepless nights. She had reached a point where the theories she had constructed about her husband's disappearance had taken on such defined contours that, for her, they were no longer just theories. They were convictions. And convictions of that kind in a place like Red Hollow at a time like that were dangerous in a way that Dessa perhaps couldn't fully comprehend. On the 3rd morning, she had thanked Harmon Giles, placed the bags back in the wooden frame, and followed the valley path northward, toward the bend in the trail where the Calloway lands began. Harmon had stood at the door and watched her leave. He had wanted to say something. He had felt that pressure in his chest of someone who knows they should warn someone about something, but can't find the right words, because they're not sure exactly what they're warning about. He had remained silent, and Dessa had disappeared around the bend in the trail, swallowed up by the shadow of the trees that closed the path like an arch above her head. The valley had continued its day as usual, the stream running, the birds singing on the slopes, the wind descending from the ridges with that scent of damp earth and pine that was the permanent smell of Red Hollow. But something had subtly changed that day. It was difficult to name. It was that feeling that the older residents of the valley knew well, the feeling that a stone had been thrown into still water, and that the ripples, however small, would eventually reach all the banks. Elias Calloway had seen Dessa arrive even before she did. There was always someone watching the road. It had always been that way, and when the messenger had gone up to the main house to report that a woman alone with heavy bags was approaching, Elias had sat for a long moment, his fingers interlaced on the dark wooden table, his eyes fixed on some point ahead that wasn't exactly the wall. It was something beyond the wall, something only he could see. Then he had said 3 words to his eldest son, who was standing to his right. No one besides the 2 of them knew what those words meant, but the son had left through the back door immediately, without asking any questions. Dessa Wren arrived at the entrance to the Callaway property mid-morning, when the sun had finally risen high enough to reach the bottom of the valley for a few hours. The light fell sideways, cutting between the trees in wide yellowish bands that illuminated the ground covered in old leaves without actually warming the air. It was a scenic light, more than a warm one, the kind of light that makes a place seem beautiful from a distance and unsettling up close. The entrance was marked by 2 large stones set in the ground on either side of the path, with no gate, no visible fence nearby. But anyone paying attention could see that the absence of a gate didn't mean the absence of a boundary. The stones were imposing enough, and there was something about the arrangement of the trees on either side, black cypresses mixed with old oaks whose branches intertwined above the path, that created a natural corridor with a clarity of message that no sign needed to reinforce. You were entering someone else's territory, and that other person knew it before you did. Dessa paused for a moment in that tree-lined corridor. She took the frame off her back, set her bags on the ground, and stood still, breathing. It wasn't hesitation. It seemed more like a deliberate gesture, like someone stopping before crossing a river to gauge the current. She had arrived there after 2 years of searching. She had walked for days to reach that specific point. And now she stood at the entrance, not because she was afraid to go in, but because she was, in some silent way, preparing herself. She had walked perhaps 50 meters into the corridor of trees when Elias's eldest son appeared in the path ahead of her. He had emerged from among the trees with a naturalness that suggested he had been standing there for some time, waiting. He was a large man in his early 30s, with the same kind of rigidity in his body that people described in his father, that posture of someone who doesn't bend. He hadn't said anything immediately. He had stood in the middle of the path, his arms at his sides, looking at Dessa with an expression that wasn't exactly threatening, but also wasn't exactly welcoming. It was the expression of someone assessing a situation. Dessa had given her name. She had said she was looking for Mr. Elias Callaway. She had said this with the same direct calm she had used when asking Harmon Giles about the family, without submission, without aggression, just direct. The son had been silent for a moment that was long enough to be uncomfortable. Then he had said that his father was busy. He had said this without moving a single muscle beyond those necessary to speak. His eyes fixed on Dessa with that intensity that people use when they are trying to read someone without giving anything in return. Dessa had said she could wait, and she had dropped her bags on the ground and sat on them with a tranquility that, according to the person who later told the story, had clearly surprised her son. There was something in that gesture, in the decision to simply sit and wait on the road to the property of a family like the Callaways, that communicated something very specific, that Dessa Wren hadn't come that far to be intimidated by silence or posture. She had arrived with the firmness of someone who has nothing left to lose, and that is always the most difficult position to negotiate. The son had been looking at her for a few more seconds. Then he had gone back into the trees without saying anything more. She had waited for this. The sun had moved slowly through the bands between the trees. Birds sang on the slopes above. The stream, invisible but audible, ran somewhere below the path with that constant sound that in the enclosed valleys of the Appalachians functions as a kind of breath of the place, always present, always the same, indifferent to everything that happens above it. After perhaps an hour, Elias Callaway had appeared. He had come from the upper path, descending with the long, deliberate strides of someone accustomed to steep terrain. 2 of his sons were behind him, at a respectful distance, accompanying without trying to outdo each other. Elias had stopped a few meters from Dessa and had looked at her in the same way his son had, assessing. But there was something different in the father's gaze. It was older, more patient, the gaze of someone who had assessed many situations over many years and had learned not to let that assessment show on his face while it was happening. Dessa had stood up. She had said her name again. She had said that she was looking for information about her husband, Virgil Wren, a drover who had passed through those lands 3 years before. She had said this looking directly at Elias, without looking away. Elias had listened to everything in silence. Then he had said, in a voice that the people of the valley described as deep and slow, that drovers passed through his lands frequently and that it was difficult to remember each one. He had said this without any visible tension, with the tranquility of someone saying something perfectly reasonable. Dessa had said she understood. She had described Virgil, his height, hair color, a scar on the right side of his chin that had resulted from a fall from a horse years before. She had described the animals he carried, the goods he transported on that particular trip. She had given all these details with a precision that came from 2 years of careful reconstruction, and she had observed Elias's face as she spoke. Elias had listened to everything. A silence had fallen. Then he had said that he was sorry, but that he couldn't remember any man matching that description. He had said that while looking directly at Dessa, and Dessa had looked directly at him, and in that glance that lasted less than 2 seconds, there was a wealth of information that neither of them had put into words, but which both had received clearly. Elias had invited Dessa to have something hot at the house. He had said it with a hospitality that sounded genuine enough to be disconcerting, and Dessa had accepted, picked up her bags and followed the path up, between her children and her father, toward the Callaway main house, which she was about to see for the first time, but which she had imagined in detail so many times on the nights of the past 2 years that she felt, disturbingly, that she already knew it. The house was large by valley standards, built of dark oak. It had 2 stories and a veranda that ran the entire length of the facade. There was a solidity to it that came not only from the quality of the construction, but from the way it had been positioned on the hillside, leaning against the mountain rock at its back, facing the entire valley. From there, one could see everything that came and everything that went. The house had been built by someone who had given much thought to visibility. Marvella Callaway was on the porch when they arrived. She was smaller than Dessa had imagined, a woman in her 60s with completely white hair and those clear eyes that the people of the valley talked about. She had looked at Dessa with a different kind of attention than the men had. It wasn't assessment. It was recognition, as if she knew exactly who Dessa was, where he had come from, and what was inside those heavy suitcases, without any of that information needing to be spoken aloud. He had served tea without being asked. He had sat at the same table as Dessa, something none of the other children had ever done. And it had been Marvella, not Elias, who had led the conversation in the following hours. She had asked about Dessa's trip. She had asked where she had come from. She had listened to the answers with that complete attention that some people have, and that is simultaneously comforting and alarming. Comforting because you feel seen, alarming because you realize you are being watched completely, with no control over what is being revealed. Dessa had answered the questions, and at the same time she had observed. She had observed the house, the details visible from the kitchen table, the shelves, the utensils, the layout of the rooms whose doors she could see from the hallway. She had observed the children coming and going without looking directly at her. She had observed Elias, who had sat in a corner and remained silent after Marvella had taken over the conversation, but whose eyes never stopped following Dessa. And she had noticed a small thing that later she would say was the moment when certainty had settled permanently within her. On one of the kitchen shelves, among canning jars and kitchen tools, there was an object that didn't belong there. It was a leather buckle, the kind used to fasten goods to pack animals' pack saddles. Buckles like that were common among muleteers. They were objects of no particular value, easily found in any stable or warehouse. But this particular buckle had a mark. A small hand-carved V-shaped notch in the leather, the kind of mark that drovers used to make on their equipment to identify them when they left animals in communal stables. Virgil Wren marked all his equipment with a V carved into the leather. Dessa had looked at that buckle for perhaps 3 seconds. Then she had looked away at the teacup in front of her, taking absolute care not to let any change in her expression show. But Marvella had seen. Dessa knew that Marvella had seen, because the old woman's clear eyes had moved from the shelf to Dessa's face and back to the shelf in a brief, precise movement, and then had remained on Dessa with an expression that was not guilt, not fear, not defiance. It was something older than all of that. It was a matter of patience. Dessa spent that night at the Callaway property. The invitation had come from Marvella late in the afternoon, when the light had begun to fade behind the ridges and the valley had plunged into that early darkness. that was its permanent condition after 4 o'clock in the autumn and spring. Marvella had said, in that quiet voice that seemed to admit no argument, that the valley paths were not safe at night, that there was a room available, that it would be disrespectful to let a traveler leave under those conditions. She had said all this with the naturalness of someone being generous, but there was something in the way Elias's sons had discreetly positioned themselves near the door during that invitation that made the generosity sound different. Dessa had accepted. She had stored her bags in her assigned room, a small room on the second floor, with a narrow window overlooking the back slope of the house, not the valley. There was a bed, a basin, a water jug. There was a latch on the door from the inside, something Dessa had immediately checked with her hand before doing anything else in the room. The latch was there. It worked. She had mentally noted the distance between the window and the ground below, about 5 meters over uneven stones. Not a viable exit, but a possible one under certain circumstances. This was how Dessa Wren had learned to think over the past 2 years. Dinner had been served at the large kitchen table, the same one where tea had been drunk earlier. There was plenty of food: pork, cornbread, pickled vegetables, honey. The family had eaten with that economy of gestures and words that is the style of meals in families like this, where silence at the table is not awkward, but the norm. Elias had eaten without looking at Dessa. The children had eaten looking at their own plates. Marvella had eaten slowly, as she always did, and had made 2 or 3 observations about the weather and the harvests that had served as enough conversation to prevent the silence from becoming overtly hostile. She had eaten from this and had observed it. There were 4 children present. The eldest, the one who had appeared on the road that morning, was called Calhoun. There were 2 more whom she had learned were Burl and Rhett, and a 4th who had arrived later for dinner, younger than the others, who had been introduced only as the youngest without any name being given. The youngest had been the only one to look directly at Dessa during dinner, not with hostility, but with that poorly disguised curiosity of someone who hasn't yet fully learned to hide what they're feeling. Dessa had noticed it. She had filed it away. After dinner, Elias had gone out onto the balcony. The older children had disappeared in different directions. Marvella had stayed in the kitchen, tidying things up with slow, methodical movements, and had told Dessa that she could stay in the living room if she wanted company, or go to her room if she wanted to rest. Dessa had stayed in the room. There was a lit fireplace. There were 2 wooden chairs with worn cushions. There was a bookcase with a few books, a Bible, an agricultural almanac, and 2 or 3 more volumes that Dessa couldn't identify from her distance. There was a wall clock that made a heavy sound every second, the kind of sound that silently becomes impossible to ignore. And there was, on a low shelf beside the fireplace, a series of objects that seemed to have no immediate decorative or practical function: stones of unusual shapes, a piece of very old wood darkened by time, a dark glass bottle with some liquid that Dessa couldn't identify. Marvella had entered the room after a while and had sat down in the chair on the other side of the fireplace. She had picked up a piece of sewing and had begun to work on it with that quiet concentration that is the way certain people are present. They are completely there, but without demanding anything from you. Dessa had allowed a comfortable silence to settle in. Then she had asked carefully how long the family had lived in that valley. Marvella had answered without lifting her eyes from her sewing. She had said that the Callaways had arrived in those mountains before she herself was born, that her husband was the 3rd generation in those lands, that the mountains had changed a great deal around them, but that this particular valley had remained as it always was. She had said it with a quiet satisfaction, the pride of someone who belongs to a place so completely that the idea of belonging to another place simply doesn't exist. She had heard of that. Then she had asked, with that same direct calm that was her trademark, if many travelers passed by the property. Marvella had been silent for a moment. The needle had continued moving through the fabric. Then she had said yes, that over the years many people had stopped there, that the mountains attracted all kinds of people. That hospitality was an obligation, not a choice. In those exact words, obligation, not choice. Dessa had let that settle. Then she had said that her husband was the kind of man who always appreciated hospitality, that he was known for that among the people who did business with him. that those who knew him described Virgil as someone who left a good impression wherever he went. Marvella had stopped sewing for a second, just a second. Then she had continued. I had said that it was a rare quality in a man, and she had said it with an intonation that Dessa couldn't quite classify. It wasn't irony, it wasn't sympathy. It was something in between, something that had the texture of a message that wasn't being said directly, but was being conveyed in some other way. Dessa had gone to her room shortly after. She had locked the door. She had sat on the edge of the bed for a long time in the dark, with that leather buckle occupying all her attention, even though it was on the kitchen shelf and not in front of her. She had thought of Virgil with that quality of thought that comes from deep exhaustion. Not exactly a thought, more of a presence, a physical sensation of someone who was no longer there, but whose weight still existed in some way. She had thought about everything she had rebuilt over the course of 2 years, about every person she had spoken to, about every detail she had collected and kept. And she had thought about Marvella's gaze when the two had met on the balcony for the first time, that immediate recognition, that age-old patience. There was a question that Dessa hadn't been able to answer yet, and it had become more urgent that night than at any other time in the last 2 years. What exactly had happened to Virgil in those lands? This question had several possible answers, and Dessa had spent far too much time sorting and resorting those possibilities. The simplest was that Virgil had had an accident, a fall, a sudden illness, and that the Callaways, for some reason she couldn't quite determine, had decided not to tell anyone. That possibility existed. It was the one that demanded the least of everyone. But there were others. And it was these others who had brought Dessa to Red Hollow with those heavy suitcases and a determination that went beyond grief. Because Dessa's suitcases didn't just contain clothes and travel provisions, they contained notes, pages and pages of notes, names, dates, places, descriptions, conversations reconstructed from memory. They contained letters she had written and never sent to Virgil, trying to put into words what had happened. They contained a map she had drawn by hand, showing the route of her husband's last trip, with all the confirmed stops, and the probable stops marked in different ways. And they contained, in a leather pouch closed with 3 different clasps, something she had collected during her 2 years of searching, evidence. Small, fragmented, impossible to present to any authority in a way that would sound convincing. But for Dessa, when put together, they formed a pattern she could no longer look at and not see. A pattern that indicated Virgil was not the first, that there were others, other drovers, other travelers, other men who had stopped in those lands over the years, and who had continued their journey in ways that no one had been able to fully confirm. That night, lying in the dark with the door locked and her ear alert for any sound in the hallway, Dessa had made a decision. She had come this far to find the truth about Virgil, but she had realized that day, sitting at the Callaway table, watching her children and her father and Marvella with her clear eyes and her old patience, that finding the truth about Virgil could mean finding something much bigger than she had imagined, and that something greater was buried in those lands in a way that the surrounding mountains, with all their silent grandeur, had kept it hidden long enough for most people to have given up looking. She hadn't given up on that one. And now I was inside the property. The wall clock in the room continued its heavy ticking, audible even through the closed door, 1 second, another second, another. The mountains outside created a silence that isn't an absence of sound, but a presence of stillness so dense you can feel its weight on your shoulders. Dessa had closed her eyes, not to sleep, to think. Tomorrow she would need to be more careful than she had been today, and at the same time, tomorrow she would need to be bolder, because he had found Virgil's belt buckle, and that meant the Callaways knew more than any words they had spoken up to that point could suggest. The question was, what to do with this knowledge within a property surrounded by mountains, with men who knew every inch of that valley and who had demonstrated, over many years, an impressive ability to make certain questions simply cease to be asked. Morning arrived in Red Hollow as it always did, slowly, as if the sun had to negotiate with the mountains before it could reach the bottom of the valley. Light streamed through Dessa's narrow bedroom window at a shallow angle, illuminating a narrow strip of the wooden floor and leaving the rest of the room in the same twilight as the night. She was already awake. She had slept in short bursts, the kind of sleep that doesn't rest, but that the body accepts when it has no other option, and she had lain listening to the sounds of the house, wood contracting in the cold of the early morning, occasional footsteps she couldn't pinpoint, a distant voice somewhere outside the property even before dawn. The Callaways woke up early. She had written that down. I had gone down to the kitchen when the smell of freshly baked bread wafted up the hallway, a domestic and almost deceptively reassuring smell, the kind that makes a place seem safe before you remember why you were suspicious. Marvella was at the stove. 2 of the children had rushed through the kitchen without stopping, with the hurried pace of someone with work waiting outside, without glancing at Dessa. Elias hadn't appeared yet. Marvella had served the coffee without being asked. He had sat on the other side of the table, as he had the night before, and had begun the morning exactly where the night had ended, with that complete and silent presence that Dessa had spent hours trying to decipher in the darkness of the room. Dessa had drunk her coffee slowly. She had said that the night had been peaceful. She had said that the mountains had a different kind of silence than she was used to, denser, more permanent. She had said this as conversation, but she had observed Marvella while she spoke. Marvella had said that those born in that silence could no longer live without it, that cities made too much noise, that too much noise prevented people from thinking clearly. Dessa had agreed, and she had allowed a moment of silence to settle in, deliberately using the very silence of the valley as a tool, before saying in her usual calm voice that she had fallen asleep, thinking about the buckle she had seen on the shelf the previous afternoon. She had said it without pointing, without accusing, like someone mentioning a detail that had been swirling around in their head for no apparent reason. Marvella had remained absolutely still for a moment. It hadn't been a moment of shock. It was the stillness of someone deciding, calculating in fractions of a second, what response that moment demanded. Later he said that the buckle had belonged to a muleteer who had stopped at the property some years ago. He said that the man had left some things behind when he left at dawn without warning, as some travelers did. He said that Elias had kept the objects for a while, waiting for the owner to return, and that afterwards they had simply remained where they were. She had said all that with a fluency that came from having thought about that answer beforehand. Not that morning, but a long time ago. It was a prepared answer. It was a... Dessa recognized this in the same way she recognized other things about Marvella, not with proof, but with the certainty that comes from paying enough attention to a person. Dessa had said she understood. She had said that her husband had the same habit of leaving things behind when he left early. She had said it was a characteristic of men accustomed to long roads, who learned to travel light even when they didn't need to. He had said that while looking at the cup. Marvella had been staring at Dessa, and Dessa had lifted her eyes from the cup and met that gaze. There was something in that moment, in those 2 seconds when their eyes met on the kitchen table, with the smell of bread and the fire of the stove and the Tennessee mountains outside, that had changed the nature of the situation between them. Nothing explicit had been said, no accusation, no confession. But both knew now that the other knew, and that this shared awareness was a point of no return. Marvella had been the first to look away. She had gotten up and gone back to the stove. This was the first time since Dessa had arrived at the property that Marvella had looked away first. I had noticed that. Elias had appeared in the kitchen shortly afterward, with those long strides and that rigid posture that seemed to be the natural way for his body to exist in space. He had poured himself coffee without sitting down, standing near the window, looking out at the yard where 2 of his sons were working on something Dessa couldn't quite see from there. He had remained like that for long enough for the silence to become deliberate, not the comfortable silence of the morning, but the silence of someone who is deliberately present, who wants you to know he is there and that he is thinking. Then he had turned to Dessa and said that he thought it best she continue her journey that day. He had said this with a courtesy that was on the surface of his words, but not in what lay beneath them. He had said that the weather in the region could change quickly, and that the roads became difficult to navigate with rain. He had said that it had been a pleasure to receive her. Dessa had said that she appreciated the hospitality. He had said that before leaving he would like to see the property if it wasn't too much trouble. He had said that he had heard a lot about the Callaway lands, and that it would be a shame to leave without seeing at least a little of it. He had said it with a lightness that was completely artificial, but sounded natural enough that the refusal would be difficult without revealing something that Elias clearly didn't want to reveal. Elias had been looking at her for a moment. I had said that Calhoun could show me the area around the house. He had said immediate surroundings, with a subtle emphasis that Dessa had recorded. Not the entire property, not the more distant parts. The immediate surroundings, the controlled territory. Dessa had said it would be perfect. Calhoun had appeared as if he had been waiting for the call, which he probably was. He had greeted Dessa with that same closed expression from the previous day and had started walking without waiting for her to get ready, which she had interpreted as an attempt to control the pace, to decide what she would see and for how long, without giving her time to linger on anything. Dessa had walked alongside Calhoun around the house. She had seen the barns, the pigsty, Marvella's extensive and well-tended vegetable garden, full of those medicinal plants that the people of the valley mentioned when they spoke of the old woman. She had seen the small sawmill where wood was processed. She had seen the well and the gutter system that brought water from the stream above for the house's use. And he had tried discreetly to look beyond to the parts of the property that lay higher up the slope, to the areas where the trees closed in and the terrain rose in such a way that it was impossible to see what lay beyond. Calhoun had blocked each attempt with a subtlety that revealed practice. When Dessa slowed near an uphill path, he diverted her attention with a remark about something closer. When she turned her body toward higher ground, he positioned himself so that her angle of vision was obstructed by himself. It was a choreography he had performed before. Dessa was sure of it. It was a dance of control that had been refined over enough time to seem natural, but there was a moment when the dance had failed. It had been when they passed the west side of the property, where the land sloped down abruptly toward the stream before rising again on the other slope. There was an area there where trees had been cut down some years ago. The stumps were still there, darkened by time, and where low vegetation had grown densely and irregularly. Dessa had looked at that area as they walked and had noticed something she hadn't expected to notice. The growth pattern was irregular in a specific way. There were patches where the vegetation was taller and more vigorous than in the surrounding areas, islands of more intense green distributed throughout the area in a way that didn't follow the logic of the terrain or sunlight. Dessa had seen this pattern before, in other contexts, in other places she had visited during her 2 years of searching. She had read about it in a conversation with an old farmer from Granger County who had described, with the quiet objectivity of someone talking about agriculture, how the land responds to certain additions to the soil, disturbed land that had received something that made it more fertile in a localized and irregular way. Dessa had continued walking without stopping. She had continued the conversation with Calhoun about the weather, about the harvests, about how the valley had changed over the years, but she had stored that pattern of vegetation in her memory with the same precision with which she had stored the leather buckle on the kitchen shelf, like another piece of a larger pattern that was taking shape with a clarity she didn't know if it was due to investigation or fear of being right. When she had returned inside the house, Marvella was in the living room with Dessa's suitcases neatly arranged near the door, not aggressively, but with that silent efficiency that communicated without words that the visiting time was over. There was a package of food wrapped in cloth on one of the suitcases, provisions for the journey, a gesture of hospitality that made the farewell all the more disconcerting in its cordiality. Elias had appeared for the farewell. He had firmly taken Dessa's hand. He had wished her a good trip. He had said that he hoped she would find the answers she was looking for. He had said exactly those words, the answers she was looking for, without specifying what those answers were or where she might find them. Dessa had looked at him. She had looked at Marvella behind him, with those clear eyes that revealed nothing and yet revealed everything to those who knew where to look. He had said that he appreciated the Calloway family's hospitality. He had said that Red Hollow was a place one wouldn't easily forget. He had picked up his bags and walked down the path towards the property's exit. She had felt their eyes on her back, all the way to the bend in the trees, swallowing her up. And he had continued walking, but not by the southern path by which he had come. He had gone down to the creek, followed the bank for a while, and then climbed back up toward the valley, not to leave Red Hollow, but to find Harmon Giles. Because Dessa had left the Callaway property with her bags on her back and with something she hadn't taken with her when she arrived, the certainty, now solid and cold as a river stone, that she knew what had happened to Virgil, and with others. And he needed to decide, before the day was over, what to do with it. Harmon Giles was in the yard when Dessa arrived. He had stopped what he was doing as soon as he saw her round the bend in the path with those bags on her back, and that step that wasn't the step of someone leaving. It was the step of someone who had decided something. Harmon was a man who had lived long enough in that valley to recognize the difference between the two, and what was in Dessa's step at that moment had made something tighten inside his chest with a silent warning that he couldn't name but recognized. Dessa had entered Harmon's house uninvited, put her bags down and stood there for a moment, her back to him, breathing. Then she turned around and said, without preamble, without preparation, in that direct voice that seemed to be the only voice she possessed, that she needed him to listen to everything she had found, and then needed him to help her get out of Red Hollow before the day was over. Harmon had closed the door, he had sat down, and I had listened. Dessa had spoken for a long time. She had talked about the leather buckle with the V carved into it. She had talked about the vegetation pattern on the western side of the property. She had explained what that pattern meant, with that same quiet objectivity of the Granger County farmer who had taught her to recognize it. She had talked about Marvella's prepared answer, about Calhoun's calculated positioning during the walk, about Elias's parting words, the answers she was looking for, spoken with a precision that was not accidental. He had recounted the other names he had collected over 2 years. 4 men, besides Virgil, who had disappeared on routes through the Red Hollow Valley at different times over a little more than a decade. None of them had been searched for in an organized manner. None of them had left close enough family to insist on answers. None of them had disappeared spectacularly enough for anyone outside the valley to pay attention. Muleteers, solitary travelers, roadmen whom the world had let go without asking many questions about where they had gone. Harmon had remained silent throughout Dessa's speech. He had kept his hands on his knees and his eyes fixed on a point on the ground in front of him, and Dessa had observed his face throughout the narrative. She had noticed the small changes that passed through it, the memories that clearly rose to the surface as he listened, the connections he was making between what she said and things he had seen or felt throughout his years of living in that valley. When she had finished, the silence had lasted for a considerable time. Then Harmon had said, in a voice that had become lower than usual, that there was something he had never told anyone. He had said that once, some 6 or 7 years before, he had seen Calhoun and Burl Callaway coming down the west slope of the property before dawn, carrying something between them in a makeshift frame covered with a tarp. He had said that he had stood motionless where he was, leaning against a tree, because there was something in the way they carried it, the silent haste, the absence of a flashlight, even in the dark, the way they avoided the main path, that had made something primal inside him tell him not to move and not to make a sound. He had said that afterwards he had tried to forget what he had seen, that he had constructed reasonable explanations, that in a place like Red Hollow, where life was hard and needs were practical, there were many possible reasons for 2 men to carry something heavy up a hillside before dawn without wanting to be seen. He had said that he had tried to believe those explanations. He had fallen silent again. Dessa had said she understood. She had said that this was the most human thing in the world, to construct explanations for what we don't want to be true. She had said that she had done the same thing during the first few months after Virgil had disappeared, that she had constructed versions of the story in which he had decided to start over somewhere else, in which he had had an accident and was recovering somewhere unable to send news, in which anything was true except the thing she felt was true. I had said that at some point the explanations had stopped working. Harmon had looked at her for a long moment. There was something in that look, a mixture of guilt and relief, the expression of someone who had carried a burden for too long and who now felt, for the first time, the possibility of sharing that burden with someone. He had said he would help her get out of the valley. He had said that he knew a route that completely bypassed the Callaway lands, an old detour along the east side that climbed a ridge and descended through another valley before reaching the county's main road. It was a longer and more difficult route, especially with luggage, But it was a route that no one in the Callaway family used because it was too far from their lands for them to have any reason to know about it. Dessa had said it was perfect. They had left before noon. The path had been everything Harmon had described, long, steep, full of sections where roots made the terrain uneven in a way that demanded attention with every step. Dessa had carried the bags without complaint. Harmon had led the way, knowing every curve of that path with the familiarity of someone who had traveled it at other times in his life for other reasons. They had spoken little during the walk. There was much to think about, and the terrain demanded too much attention for conversation. It was during that hike, on the highest ridge of the eastern bypass, at a point where the trees opened up enough for the entire Red Hollow Valley to be visible below, that Dessa had stopped for a moment and looked back. From above, the valley seemed small and enclosed, that narrow corridor between the ridges, with the stream shimmering in wisps of light through the dark vegetation. You could see the roof of the Callaway house on the hillside, the thin wisp of smoke from a chimney. You could see the patchy vegetation on the west side of the property. From above, the pattern was even clearer, those patches of more intense green distributed in an order that was not random. She had been staring at this for perhaps a minute. Then he turned his back to the valley and continued to climb. What happened next is the part of the story that time has made even more opaque than the previous parts. Dessa had reached the county's main road that afternoon. Harmon had returned to Red Hollow by the same route. What Dessa had done with everything she had collected, the notes, the map, the names, what she had seen on the Callaway property, was never entirely clear. She had tried, according to what could be reconstructed much later, to take her findings to the county authorities. She had been received with the distant cordiality that rural authorities of that time reserved for women who arrived alone with complicated stories about established family lands. He had tried other avenues. He had written letters. He had returned to the region once 2 years later and had spoken with some people, not the Callaways and not Harmon, who had died in that interval of natural causes, they said. And then Dessa Wren's trail had also dissolved, not in the same way as Virgil's, not with that sudden absence that leaves no explanation. Dessa had simply stopped appearing in the records and memories of the people who had known her. She had lived the rest of her life somewhere, probably. She had grown old. She had taken what she knew with her. The Callaway family had remained in Red Hollow. The property had passed from Elias to Calhoun, and then to Calhoun's children over the following decades. The valley had changed around them. New roads, new people. The 20th century arriving with all its speed and noise even in those closed valleys of Tennessee. But the property had remained. The highlands, the dark wooden house, the western area, with its vegetation growing in a way that the newcomers to the valley no longer knew how to interpret. The mountains had kept the silence with that efficiency that is the specialty of mountains, effortlessly, without choice, simply being what they are. Places where sound doesn't travel far, where the earth absorbs what it receives without asking questions, where time acts on things in a way that erases without destroying, that leaves enough present to be felt, but insufficient to be tasted. Red Hollow still exists. The valley is still there, nestled between the parallel ridges of the Tennessee Appalachians, with that early shade and that creek that flows as it always has, indifferent. The Callaway property passed through different hands throughout the 20th century. The original house no longer exists. It was destroyed in a fire sometime in the mid-century, without anyone being able to quite explain how it started. The land continues. The western slope continues. And there is something that remains in that valley that cannot be precisely named, a quality of the silence perhaps, or the way the light falls on the narrow bottom for only a few hours a day. Something that makes people who pass through there, even without knowing anything about the history those lands hold, describe the place with the same words, regardless of when they visited or where they came from. They say it looks like a place that's waiting for something. They say it seems like a place that knows more than it reveals. Dessa Wren knew, Harmon Giles knew, and perhaps the mountains of Tennessee, with all the infinite patience of those who have existed long enough to see everything and keep everything, also know and are waiting, with that dense and permanent stillness, for someone to finally ask the right question in the right place and not accept silence as an answer. But for now, the valley sleeps, and the stream flows. And the trees on the west slope grow as they always have, taller, denser, greener than they should be. If this video captivated you until the end and you want to support the channel so that stories like this can continue to exist, the link to my ebook is in the description and in the pinned comment. Your support is what keeps all of this alive. If you've made it this far, leave a comment telling us where you're watching from. That's one of the best ways to know that this story reached where it needed to. Like the video if it made you think, and subscribe to the channel so that the next story can also find its way to you. See you next time.